Thank you. Good evening. Happy to be with you. I want to share with you the screen, if it's possible.
Yes.
Do you see the screen?
Yes, excellent. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, I try just to fix it up. Yeah. So thank you, Linda. Thank you for this important conference. We'll try fast to do some of the mission that you asked me to prepare. You are aware that this issue is very complicated and deep and heavy with details and pains, and it's ongoing issue, ongoing Nakba, ongoing catastrophe of the Palestinians everywhere. So we try to be focused on three elements: the meaning of the Nakba, the JNF mission, and the British, including the British part. And we try also to talk a little bit about what's going on in the Naqab, in the Negev, with the Palestinian Bedouin community using the JNF actions. So when we talk about the Nakba, we are really a little bit confused to ask where we start the Nakba, because usually we do refer to the 1948 as the crucial year of the beginning of the Nakba. But in fact, many historical events and steps have been done and occurred before 1948. What is connected to you is Balfour Declaration since 1917 and the British mandate or occupation of Palestine for about 30 years, preparing the creation of the Jewish state. And for preparing a Jewish state, you must be part, or at least a background of preparing the Nakba, because the Nakba is part of the colonial project of the Zionist movement. It couldn't be in other way. If you want to create a Jewish country with Jewish majority, with Jewish Zionist propaganda, refer to Palestine as an empty land, or land with no people for people with no land, as they expressed that in different ways, by art or by political speeches, and of course by plans on the ground. But in fact, the land was not empty, it was full with people. It had cities and towns and villages, urban life, and agriculture, and it was part of the Middle Eastern developing cities and countries like the neighboring Lebanon or Syria or Egypt or other places. It had beautiful cities like Jaffa over here, and this is the neighborhood of Al-Manshiyah that Linda mentioned, and we walked there to see what happened to this neighborhood in the city of Jaffa. This is part of the newspapers and the institutions in the city of Jaffa. They had theaters and train station and newspapers and schools and cultural events, and cinemas, and many things like other people and other normal people. But the Zionist movement insisted to see the area is an empty, but in fact they knew that it's not empty. So what we should do in order to implement the vision, in order to make the vision fact, they did emptied or emptized the land. They transferred the Palestinians. The majority of the Palestinian people, they had been living in the area that the state of Israel was created at, was forcibly expelled. So the ethnic cleansing process of the Palestinian people was part of the vision and the mission of the Zionist movement. And one of the strong bodies and the strong arms to implement this vision and this mission was the JNF. And we can hear from leaders in the Zionist movement, including leaders of the JNF, ideas of transferring Palestinians out of Palestine already in 1920s, 1930s. Didn't happen in 1948, it didn't start in 1948 or after that. It was already before. One of the famous figures of the JNF is Joseph Weitz, said that this land couldn't be for both Jews and Palestinians. We should transfer the Palestinians outside of Palestine. Others said David Ben-Gurion by himself recognized, he said we should recognize the good results of the JNF. He said that in 1938, the results of the JNF of transferring communities in the lands that they bought during the 20s and the 30s. Menachem Osishkin, who was the head of the JNF in 1930s, said in 1938, transferring people is moral thing. If you ask me to transfer 60,000 people outside of their villages, I will say this is moral step that we can do. So transferring Palestinians was already there. It didn't happen as a reaction of any event or any step that the Palestinians took by themselves. The number of the Palestinians who lived in Palestine in 1947 was about 1,300,000, and the Jews about 600,000. But with the cooperation with the colonial power, with Britain, with the United Nations at that time, the Jewish and the Zionist movement managed to achieve through United Nations partitioning plan solution about 54% of the land of Palestine. And in fact, on the ground, after their occupations, they took even 78% of the land of Palestine, not only 54% of it. In the area that the Zionist movement captured, they transferred more than 750,000 Palestinians from more than 600 towns and villages and cities. I know that most of the books and historians still talk about 500, 532, but the research is still ongoing, and we have already maps with the names of about 600 Palestinian towns that had been erased from the landscape during the Nakba since 1948 till today. So after this expulsion and ethnic cleansing, what would the Zionist movement or the state of Israel do with the property of these refugees? They left behind a huge property, lands and houses and money and books and everything that you can imagine had been captured by the Israelis, and Israel, of course, will confiscate this property and use it for the purpose of Jewish state, for the purpose of the Jewish community that will immigrate to the state of Israel and use the Palestinian property. In parallel, the Israeli policy was to erase as much as possible the identity of the place, the Palestinian identity of the place, in order to Israelize and to Judaize the area as, of course, they dreamed it should be as much as possible Hebraized and Jewish and Israeli. And of course, as the nature of the Zionist movement was Western, came from Europe, they wanted to see it more Western than Eastern, which should be something that reminds them the landscape or the views in Europe. And we will see how the JNF did this actually by their forests. But when we talk about demolition, this is a very important question, and I think also Ghadir talked a little bit about the meaning of demolition we know that demolition physically to destroy houses or to erase houses from the landscape, but in fact, it's much deeper and wider than to take only stones away. It's to demolish the spirit of the people, the culture of the people, the language of the people, everything that the Palestinian community created in Palestine for generations and thousands of years will be destroyed by the Zionist movement almost at once. And I will not talk about the trauma beyond these actions, but if you look around in Palestine or inside the state of Israel today, there are, of course, 95% of the 600 localities that I mentioned had been destroyed, bulldozed. Still, 5% standing, or some buildings or some houses are standing, but these are used in different way by the new regime or the new country. Some mosques had been converted to synagogues, or just standing closed in the area, or partly destroyed, or a museum like this one in Kiryat Shmona. Churches are abandoned and partly destroyed in the Galilee. Some of the ruins of the villages we still see are these destroyed or demolished houses or still standing. So I just wanted to say that even when you see these villas, beautiful villas, original Palestinian villas in the beautiful cities of Jerusalem, for example, West Jerusalem, Tiberias, or Be'er Sheva, Bir Saba, the villas are still standing, but they are used by settlers, by Israelis, by Jewish families. Also, those are demolished houses, demolished buildings. This Palestinian schools, this school on the right from Deir Yassin, and this one of Beit Nabala are still standing, but used for Jewish Orthodox movement, Chabad, or the JNF office. What about demolishing the Palestinian graveyards? 600 towns, villages had more hundreds of graveyards and cemeteries. All of them almost are destroyed. Some of them are still in the area. You can see ruins of the graveyards, but this is also part of the demolition process. And these refugees looking at and looking for returning to their places, most of them are inside the JNF forests. So the JNF that was established in 1901, many years before the establishment of the State of Israel, as a body that will implement the Zionist vision and the Zionist projects. Of course, the propaganda, as I said, they convinced the Jewish communities around the world that they are going to make the desert bloom, or to redeem the land of Israel for the people of Israel. By the way, this is the policy till today. This is the ideology beyond the JNF till today. Even myself, as a citizen of the State of Israel, I cannot get any benefit of the lands that administrated by the JNF. I wouldn't say owned, but administrated by the JNF. The JNF was used even before the establishment of the State of Israel in order to expel Palestinian communities, to capture their lands, and to use them only for the Jewish communities. If they don't build a settlement or a kibbutz or a mushav, they will plant forests or create parks on these areas that belong to Palestinian refugees. And they created about 70 parks and forests around the country. Some of them, by the way, following your nation's names. They are Canada Park, United States Park, and British Park, and others. The JNF by itself, in order to prepare the area for planting the trees, they destroyed the houses physically, they bulldozed houses, and they planted the trees in order to hide the ruins of the Palestinian villages. And it's known inside the JNF. One of the officer, the director of the science department in the JNF said that many of the JNF parks are located on land where Palestinian villages once stood. The forests are there to conceal this. So one of the things that when you drive around the country and you see beautiful green areas, you will not see the ruins. And this was one of the missions of the European, I would say the pine trees, the colonial trees that the JNF planted on the Palestinian lands. And one of them is the British Park. The British Park that started, was planted since the 50s, is covering ruins of number of Palestinian villages that had been captured in 1948. The bigger one, the biggest one and the most important one is the village of Ajur that had more than 4,000 people in 1948, which means if this village was not expelled, we're supposed to see a town with at least 50,000 people live in this place. Other villages like Kudna, Deir Dubban, Zakaria, their lands also inside the British Park. The JNF did the same policy around the country. By the way, till today, the JNF owns 13% of the land of the state of Israel, which is a huge amount of areas of lands, and they can do whatever they want in there. But as he said, beyond the racist policy, there are racist projects. And even in some cases, they will come to a Palestinian community that still live in certain area and expel the Palestinian community under the excuse that this area is not prepared for living or for housing. They will expel the Palestinian community and bring Jewish community to build for them a new town. The last example is a Bedouin Palestinian village called Hiran in the Naqab area in the Negev in the south of the state of Israel. The community, the Palestinian community that was expelled 3 times, by the way, since 1948, but they live in Hiran for about 50 years. They were expelled, and instead of them, they built a new Jewish town called Hiran, the same name almost, but with different people. So they brought the Jewish community to that place and expelled the Palestinians to other places. During of course, the 74 years, Israel confiscated most of the land that the Palestinian citizens in Israel owned. My grandfather had a wide land. Now we don't have anything, almost. It was confiscated under many excuses. The area that still has, that Palestinian community still have some lands is the south part of Israel, which is the Naqab, the Negev, the Bedouin community inside Israel. And during these days, the JNF is pushing the Israeli government in order to confiscate more and more land and to move Palestinian Bedouin communities to different places and to take their lands for the JNF or for the Jewish state purposes. The case of Al-Araqib village that we see this photo from, one of the destruction of this village had been destroyed for 200 times. Last one was this week. And every time the families built in their new houses, it's a wood house. They built that very fast. The JNF and the Israeli police will come within 1 month and destroy it again. So still doing that even in these days in very brutal ways, just to transfer Palestinian Bedouin communities from their original land and push them to live in townships that the state of Israel was created for this purpose. By the way, since 1948 to today, Israel didn't build for the Palestinian citizens of Israel any town, any new town or any new village or any new city. it built maybe 1,000 new cities and kibbutzes only for Jews. The only thing that they did with the Bedouins in the Nakab is to push them outside of their original houses and to build for them new towns to live in. They built 7 towns, but it was not for the purpose of developing or helping the people for housing or other purposes. It was in order to transfer them from their place to a new place and to confiscate their original land. By the way, the status of the land that they live in today is state land. So they don't even own land. So this policy of to uproot the Palestinian communities from their original lands that they owned for generations and to let them live, in this case, in state land in order to be disconnected of the historical and the original land. So yeah, I can't finish now. Yeah, Linda. Yeah. So I just to conclude that the Palestinian community in the Nakab was, of course, 90% of them were transferred in 1948. Only 10% remained in the Nakab, about 10,000 people. Today, there are about 300,000 people, and they are under really very difficult conditions that created by the state of Israel. And the last case of another village called Sawa, the JNF came suddenly in one day. They uprooted the olive trees of Sawa and planted pine trees instead of them. And if you heard about the clashes that happened in the Nakab during last January, it was this case that till today the JNF still using the same brutal colonial policy in order to expel Palestinian communities from their place. So I think this is in general, of course, every small detail is very important, but I think every single demolition of house or confiscating of one dunam of land is part of the wider ideology of the Zionists and the JNF policy of Judaizing the place and colonizing the place based on the racist approach for the Jews, only. So I believe that the only thing that we should do is not only to react against small stories, but to look at the wider story and to prepare a plan for stopping the whole policy of the Zionist movement and the JNF policy, like this very beautiful project that had been initiated by a Jewish South African group that came to visit South Africa forest in the Galilee, and they found out that the forest was built on Lubia village, Palestinian village that was expelled and destroyed in 1948. And they made this beautiful campaign for Stop the JNF, and they came to visit the refugees of the village, and they created together a campaign in order to at least raise the awareness regarding the policy of the JNF to plant trees and to hide the Palestinian ruins and to prevent the return and the rights of the Palestinian refugees. Thank you very much.